My name is Ashaki Benta. Um, I'm on the coordinating committee of the Southern Workers Assembly. Also a longtime member of Black Workers for Justice and a retired organizer from United Electrical Workers (UE). Um, anyway, I just want to thank all of you for joining us tonight for our um, Building Rank and File Power to Fight Fascism webinar that we're holding tonight. I think we all know the kind of period that this is. We're all aware of the things going on around us, how dangerous and um, unjust conditions are in this country right now and around the world uh, that we face. But um, I would also ask us to consider as we, have discussion tonight um, that kind of a small crack in the morass has been opened up in this period as well. And the moment is pregnant, if you don't mind me using that term, pregnant with possibilities and opportunities to kind of force meaningful change in this period. Um, and for us to, you know, to beat back some of the negative conditions that we're faced with and move forward as working and oppressed people in our communities. But we can only take advantage of this period if we take the time to take action and to move forward. Not just any actions that people want to do, but those kind of actions that are derived from what we might consider a correct assessment and producing a correct strategy and a correct series of tactics for the moment that would help us move forward. So our mission in SWA is to organize the South. We want to, I guess I'll put it, break the back, so to speak, of this historic anti-union bastion of oppression and exploitation for working and oppressed people. So our mission tonight is kind of to examine this moment and look ahead, hopefully examining some new, some old tactics that we might be able to use and apply in our new circumstances and conditions today. So with that, I'd like to bring forward our guest tonight. We're so honored to have Bill Fletcher with us to open discussion about this question of building rank and file power in this period and under the conditions that we see of growing fascism. And all of you know Bill is a long time labor leader and trade unionist and freedom fighter. So Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ashaki, and thank you, members of the Southern Workers Assembly, for inviting me. I am going to divide my talk into two parts. One is about the danger, and the second is about recommendations and responding to that. But I want to start maybe in a strange place. For the last number of election cycles for president, it has been frequently said that that particular election is the most important election in our lifetime. I remember hearing that a few cycles back. And what happened, in effect, is that a number of people began to think, well, I'm tired of hearing that. We're hearing it all the time. It's sort of meaningless. So I was thinking about this. And it actually turns out it's not meaningless. It's actually true that each of these election cycles up through where we are now has been the most important. Why? Because we're actually in a cold civil war. We're in a cold civil war period where the stakes in each election are becoming more and more clear and very definitive. And in that situation, where the far right is interested in absolutely annihilating us, the election takes on a greater importance. Now, let me explain a little bit about how we got there. In the history of the United States, there are periods when the consensus within the ruling circles breaks down. Most dramatic was in the Civil War, but it's happened at other periods. One was after the Civil War with the end of Reconstruction, the defeat of Reconstruction. Another time was after Franklin Roosevelt was elected and introduced the New Deal, and a segment of capital was so revolted by this that they began plotting a coup. And that was a coup that has gotten attention on and off. And they tried to recruit a Marine Corps general named Smedley Butler to lead a march on Washington of veterans to overthrow Roosevelt or to force Roosevelt to appoint Butler as the dictator. Butler did not agree to do this, and in fact went on to testify before Congress, but he was treated in the mainstream as if he was sort of like a lunatic, that this wasn't really serious, but it was. A few years later, as in effect a continuation from the same thing, there were further efforts that were actually aligned with the German Nazis. And Rachel Maddow discussed a lot of this in her podcast from earlier this year. That was really quite dramatic about the efforts that were undertaken that included exploration of insurgencies in states all around the United States. So after World War II, though, there was a relative period of semi-stability among the ruling circles, even when they disagreed. Disagreements around desegregation, disagreements around a number of things, but they were held together to a great extent by the Cold War. And when the Cold War ends, the differences within the ruling circles become very acute and very, very apparent. But the differences have been arising for a while. In the aftermath of Goldwater's campaign in 1964 and his defeat, there were key people in his campaign, like Paul Weyrich, Richard Viguerie, and others, that began to explore the methods towards the creation of a new right. And by new right, they were looking not to be a conservative force, but to essentially overthrow the 20th century. So if you want to understand the far right in the United States, think of it as a movement to overthrow the 20th century, overthrow everything that was won in a variety of social movements, and return us to a pre-1912 period. They began efforts that included building institutions and supporting them, like the Heritage Foundation, the National Conservative Political Action Committee. They began training and running candidates for a local office, in litigation against busing, against abortion, and affirmative action, as well as the building of mass movements, right-wing led mass movements that were easy for people to join. Movements against busing, Canal Tree. You can go on and on. And they became very good at utilizing these mass movements to recruit people who would effectively be cadre of this developing new right, this right-wing populist movement that over time evolves towards MAGA. These forces, like Viguerie and Weyrich, were interesting in many ways because they were prepared to align themselves with people they despised, like Richard Nixon. They viewed Richard Nixon as a liberal. but they saw in an alliance an ability to make some inroads that they needed, including court appointments, taking over certain agencies, as well as giving them space in order to operate. So this movement strengthens during the 70s, ultimately producing Ronald Reagan, and this beginning of this shift in US politics. But the bigger shift, I would argue, comes in 1994 with Newt Gingrich and the so-called contract with America, where the Republicans take over. And it's, again, this is after the end of the Cold War. And you start to see a very different tone taken in US politics, and particularly at the federal level. At the local level, there's always been kind of weirdness that is going on. But at the federal level, there was something very different that started to happen. And this idea of essentially a war of annihilation carried out by the forces like Gingrich. This gets further accelerated after Timothy McVeigh carries out the terrorist bombing in Oklahoma City, and we start to see the very apparent rise of a military arm of the right-wing populists, although elements of that had been seen in the 1980s, particularly in the Midwest, with groups like the Posse Comitatus and Aryan Nation and others. So in the 1990s on, this growth of this movement becomes something that we take note of, but many liberals and even progressives and leftists were into major denial of the seriousness of the growth of this far right. Many people on the left said, no, you're overstating this and you're distracting us from fighting centrist Democrats and others. But this movement on the far right was becoming more well organized and well armed. The next major evolution is when Barack Obama is elected. Right? How dare a Black person be elected to be the president of what they saw as a white republic? And the Obama administration, true to form, made a strategic miscalculation in assuming that they were conducting politics in an earlier era, that they were dealing with adults, and that it was sufficient for them to be adults in the room. Whereas the Republicans, which were consolidating as a hard right party, had a very different view, and their view was one of destroying the Obama administration and the Democrats. And in fact, people like Mitch McConnell made it very clear as soon as Obama was elected that their objective was to make sure that Obama was a one-term president. Obama's failure to act quickly in 2009 opened the door, the floodgates, for what we came to see as the Tea Party movement. And the Tea Party movement was really the predecessor of MAGA. Many people discounted the Tea Party movement, described it as an astroturf movement, but it was much more than that. It was a right-wing populist, almost a proto-fascist movement that was developing and helped to lay the foundation for Donald Trump's presidency. When we're looking at the far right today and the MAGA forces, it's important for us to recognize, A, that the Republican Party is consolidated as a right-wing party for dictatorship. They have driven out most of the so-called moderates and liberals. There is no moderate wing of the Republican Party. There are so-called moderates floating around there, like the remnants from a storm, but they do not constitute a significant force. So they're very, very consolidated. And their objective, as they've been making it very clear, is to carry out this overthrow of the 20th century. Their objective must be seen in the context of an aim to utilize elected office in order to destroy the foundations of any pretense of constitutional democracy. making the United States more akin to Hungary or Putin's Russia. And they have outlined this in their Project 2025, which until fairly recently, many people, liberals, progressives, and leftists, were ignorant of to a great extent, and didn't understand that Project 2025 is the Mein Kampf of the MAGA movement. It is their outline for what they intend to do. And it's something that we need to be talking with our members, our allies, our family members about, that it's all outlined there to destroy environmental regulations, to eliminate the possibility of abortion rights, to essentially lay the foundation for the extermination of LGBTQ populations, to eliminate so-called DEI and affirmative action, and to affirm this bizarre notion that white people are the victims of racism. It's all there. It's all there. And so when people say, well, this is just, not just about democracy. Let's talk about bread and butter issues. The bread and butter issues are there. Project 2025 wants to eliminate unions. They want to eliminate the National Labor Relations Act. When I'm talking about overthrowing the 20th century, that's no exaggeration. That is their objective. In that context, the question is, then what? Right? Well, first is, for those that say it won't matter who gets elected, I just say, well, look at Project 2025, and you answer that question. Will there be environmental rights? Will there be environmental legislation? Will there be steps to deal with the fact that the planet is burning? The answer is clearly no. What's going to happen to a woman's right to choose? Well, we should have been seeing what's been happening anyway, but it's very clear that that will be eliminated. But on top of all of that, there's something that really isn't discussed very much, which is that there are forces gathering, and it overlaps with the MAGA forces that have been led by the American Legislative Exchange Council that seek to bring about a constitutional convention. That is to change the U.S. Constitution. And this is amazing because there's only been one constitutional convention in U.S. history. That was in 1787. Changes to the Constitution have been through amendments. The far right has decided it is unlikely that they can make the changes that they want through amendments. Therefore, the objective is to call a constitutional convention. And if they have, I believe it's 3/4 of the states that pass resolutions in the state legislatures calling for a constitutional convention, they can call one. And at that point, all bets are off. There is no precedent for what happens next. But we could conceivably come out of a constitutional convention with the United Theocratic States of America. All right, so what does that mean? What should we do? Should we be paralyzed? No, absolutely not. But we also shouldn't expect that the pendulum of history will automatically swing back in our direction. Things will happen to the extent to which we bring about changes, not because we sit back and wait, not thinking that people like Trump will demonstrate himself to be, once again, a fool, and the people will turn against him. That was one of the mistakes in Germany, where communists and social democrats believed that Hitler coming to power would ultimately destroy the Nazis, because Hitler would prove himself to be an imbecile. As we know, things didn't quite work out that way. So what do we do? Well, there's a few things. I was involved and have been involved in the formation of an organization called Standing for Democracy, recently formed, which is a worker-focused organization aimed at fighting the rising tide of fascism. And we're interested in engaging organizations and individuals in that fight. This is not just an electoral fight. It's a fight that's going to have to be ideological. It's going to have to be in the courts. It's going to have to be on the ground, and I'll get to that. Part of what needs to happen, and what we're going to be trying to do, but I encourage all of you, is to carry out real grassroots education with your members. Most people don't really understand the nature of the far right, and sometimes think that these lunatics on the far right are so out there that they must be marginal, not recognizing that they actually have a base. And that part of what happens is that the far right exists within a bubble where their views are constantly reinforced through institutions like so-called Fox News and others that reinforce their particular view of the world. So, many of our members rely on Fox News, unfortunately. And so we need to conduct real education. We need to build organizations through unions and through other worker organizations at the grassroots level. That means not just relying on the internet. What the far right understands is that the web, the internet, is important as long as it's done in conjunction with direct mass organizing. It does not replace individual interaction. It reinforces. Many progressives, unfortunately, have come to the conclusion that struggle is done behind a keyboard, and that it's okay to text and tweet, and that that's the way we build mass movements. And that's completely wrong. There's no historical foundation for that. In our local areas, we need to, in our organizations, we need to be very consciously thinking about opposing the far right. And that means beginning with an assessment of the right in your area. Who is the far right in your geographic area? What do they look like? What are their organizations? Who are their leaders and spokespersons? What are their strategies? What are they attempting to do? And that leads to being prepared to disrupt the right. So think about these many examples when these far right, these fascists have shown up at school committee meetings, at abortion clinics. The optics are terrible from our side because they get there, they intimidate people, and there is almost never any of us there responding. Why aren't we there? Standing right behind these fascists with our arms crossed, just waiting, right? And just waiting. What are we doing? I know what we're doing. We're tweeting, we're texting, we're shaking our hands. We're saying, "Oh God," right? But that doesn't make change. We need to be there. We need to be there when election officials are being intimidated by these fascists, threatened on regular. Where are we? Where are we to say, no, we are there with election officials. We want to make sure that there's a fair election. We're going to be there with you, as well as we're going to be there protecting the vote. So we need to be doing that. We need to be defending women and women's institutions, including but not limited to abortion clinics. When these fascists show up and are surrounding these clinics and are intimidating women, where are we? When they are trying to intimidate people who are trying to control their bodies, again, where are we? We need to be there in force. And we need to be defending the LGBTQ plus populations. When I said before, the far right seeks to exterminate the LGBTQ population, that was no euphemism. All of the indicators are there, everything that they want to do, but in stages, making it more difficult, if not impossible, to adopt, making it more difficult, if not impossible, to marry, making it more difficult, if possible, to come out of your house. It goes down a certain path, and history has demonstrated this many, many times. We have to also be prepared to engage in self-defense and prepare ourselves at multiple levels, including guarding against provocations. One of the things that I recently was looking at was how in a number of pro-Palestinian demonstrators, there have been right-wing provocateurs who have gone in order to incite the protesters to engage in various kinds of activities, including anti-Semitic rhetoric and including various kinds of actions. We need to train our members and our leaders on how do you identify potential provocateurs and what do you do when these people show up. And finally, we need to learn from the New Popular Front in France, which I thought was a marvelous example, in which they not only came together to stand against the rise of these new fascists, but they also articulated a vision, a progressive vision for what they want to see France become. And I would say to us, we have nothing to gain from the status quo. That doesn't mean we don't protect our institutions, but status quo is not enough. We need to be the ones that are advocating for the expansion of democracy rather than contraction. We need to be the ones that are expanding on workers' rights, on environmental rights, on changing the way that the economy functions. We need to be speaking that. Now, that may or may not end up being the voice of the Democratic Party, but this goes to a point about that, which is, as my friend Carl Davidson has pointed out, the Democratic Party is not really a political party, it's an alliance. There are several parties within that alliance. Progressives need to become conscious that we are part of that. And that as part of that, as a party, quote unquote, within that, we need to be articulating our own vision for what needs to happen. We need to be pushing tactical allies that we are engaged with in the fight against the fascists. The tactical allies don't have to be our friends, and in many cases are going to be people that we're going to be in struggle with and are in struggle with and have been in struggle with. But what we may agree on is that we must defeat MAGA, and we must defeat them now and crush them politically. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really, really excellent, Bill. Very, very good. And I think what we'd like to do now is maybe open up for a few questions, I think, or comments that people were putting in the chat. I think Libby's going to help me review some of the stuff that's in there, and we'll spend, maybe the next, 10, 12 minutes, entertaining some of these questions and allowing Bill to respond, or any of us to respond. So great, thank you. Libby, have we seen one that we can start with? No questions? Any comments?
It looked like it was mostly commentary, more than questions for Bill. I wonder if people have any questions they want to put in. Oh, there's one right there. Ashaki, do you see it?
My screen, I can't see everybody on my screen right now.
Hi, Bill, it's Libby, how you doing? We do have a question in here from Unite Here about a group of canvassers in Charlotte, and they're wondering if you have any advice on how they might talk to people on the doors about this election.
Yeah, thank you. A few things about this. I think in many ways, the most important thing to do is to begin by listening. And listening to what people are identifying to be some of their issues and concerns. I think it's important, yes, I'm not saying we should be agnostic. I think it's important to be clear about the importance of this election and some of the issues. But listen to how people think about the economy and what they say. What are some of the things that people are unfamiliar with? What might be attractive to them coming out of MAGA? When people talk about, for instance, the challenge of immigration, I think it's really important to ask, why are people coming to the United States? What's motivating that? Let's talk about that. I mean, do people think it's everyone wants to be in America? I mean, are people think that just folks are really ready to give up on their homeland just to move here for a job? I mean, what? So I think part of it is asking some probing questions of people about what's going on in their head. When people say, when the right says that the immigrants are taking our jobs, well, which jobs are they taking? We have an unemployment level rate at historic levels. I mean, historic. And so what jobs are people talking about? Like in the building trades right now, there is an absolute need for workers. There's a workforce need in the building trades. There's tremendous opportunities right now. And so I think that's the critical thing I would say. Ask questions, listen to what people are saying. And then also, I think it's useful to leave people with, if not something to read, give them sources of information that they can themselves access. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bill. Again, really appreciate what you said. We got another couple of 2 questions and a comment. So one question is, how do we take lessons from the new Popular Front in France and bring them into our situation here? That's one.
Well, one of the lessons is to get away from purism. And this is something that seems to be very contagious within left and progressive.
Terrorism?
Huh?
Get away from terrorism?
No, purism. Purism.
Okay.
We definitely need to get away from terrorism, but from purism. We have progressives, and I noticed this really from the 1970s on, that there's a tendency in the left towards real sectarianism, towards thinking that there's a short distance between God's mouth and our ears, and that we have to agree on at least 95% of things in order to align. And I think one of the things that we see in the new Popular Front was, in the face of the danger from the fascists, these folks on the left said, and ultimately some that were center left and center, that the danger was so great that the differences needed to be put aside, at least temporarily. That did not mean permanently putting those things aside. So we have to figure out greater ways of ongoing strategic unity among progressive forces, getting organized and recognizing that there will be things where we will disagree. And that disagreement does not necessarily mean we have to pull guns on each other. I'm a very strong proponent of the Ukrainian people's defense against Russian aggression. Very strong. And I have friends that take a very different position. I'm not going to cast off those friends just because we have that difference of opinion. If we can work together, and as long as they're not stabbing me, because there are certain people that are prepared to stab me, and I'm not interested in working with them. But where we can say, look, there are certain areas you're not going to agree, but let's figure out where we can agree and go up against a common opponent. We can argue out Ukraine or any number of other things later. But for right now, we got to take on the main enemy.
Yeah, because we can't help these other forces if we don't have we're not representing the interests of our people here. Another question is about the courts. Is it viable? And I do see there are a couple more questions besides this, and a comment. I do see your comment, John. Is it viable? And we'll take these, and then we probably should move on. Is it a viable battleground? To seek redress in the courts, or should we try to seek to reduce the power of the courts?
I think that we have to do exactly what Vigory and Weirich did in the late 60s and early 70s, which is you don't rely on one thing. They looked at political and legislative action, litigation, and mass movements, right? And that's exactly what we need to be doing. And let me contrast that with what happened after Roe v. Wade on the progressive side, liberal and progressive side, which is after Roe v. Wade, the decision, the bulk of the women's movement and the pro-choice movement believed that Roe v. Wade was sacred, that it would not be overturned. It might be weakened, but it would not be overturned. The right wing never made that assumption. Instead, what they went about doing, which became very obvious after Roe v. Wade was overturned, was they worked at the local and state level to change laws, setting into effect trigger mechanisms so that the moment that Roe v. Wade was overturned, bingo, they move into action. Progressives and liberals are over relying on courts, assuming that the courts could defend us. Big, big mistake, strategic mistake. So I think that we need to be thinking at all these levels. A number of years ago, Ashaki, I was speaking in Texas, and this was before Abbott became the governor. And people were telling me about how bad the situation was in Texas. And I listened, and then they would like, so Bill, what do we do? And I said to them, how do we take over Texas? And their mouths dropped. And they looked at me like I just smoked some dope, right? And I said, no, I'm serious. How do we take over that? You've told me how bad the situation is. I get it. So what do you want to do? Should we give up? Right? If we're not going to give up and we're not going to keep fighting the defensive battle, how do we start thinking about the counterattack? How do we take over Texas? What are the key cities we have to win? What are the key counties to win? What are the counties we don't have to win? What are the key social movements? Who are the key opinion makers? What does the media look like in Texas? In other words, you read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and you think about this at the level of strategy and building up the counterattack. And that's what we need to be doing. That's what the right understood. That's why Vigory and Weirich were so brilliant. They understood the notion of the counterattack and slowly building up their forces. But that necessitates organization. It doesn't necessitate brand, by which I mean there's this terrible tendency that's developed among liberals and progressives where individuals think it's not important to have organization anymore. All we need is to stand out there, to have our own personal websites, our own social media presence, and to create our own brand where we can be out there speaking truth to power. I am so tired of hearing that notion of speaking truth to power. You don't speak truth to power, you combat power. You overturn power. That's what you do. Hell with the speaking truth to power. We want to win. At least that's what I want.
Oh yeah. All right. Another here. People are asking what's your view of whether or not there needs to be an independent, third party, and if the working class or if our communities should build independent political power at the local level, even if there isn't a third party. How are people viewing that?
There needs to be independent political action led by the working class. there need to be organizations that I call non-party parties, that are operating inside and outside of the Democratic Party. Organizations that are prepared to advance progressive candidacies in Democratic primaries, that are prepared to raise hell, that are prepared to organize a mass struggle. Groups like the Working Families Party, the New Virginia Majority, New Florida Majority. There's groups like that all over the country. California Calls, organizations along those lines that are prepared to fight inside and outside of the Democratic Party. We face a problem brought on by the undemocratic nature of the US electoral system. And that system makes it very difficult for third parties, electoral parties, to operate. At the same time, as a socialist, I believe it's important to build socialist organization. But I'm not saying build socialist organization at this time in history to run people for office. I'm not interested in symbolic candidacies. We don't have that luxury to run some candidacies, particularly when the far right aims to annihilate us. We are in a situation where we need to defeat them and change the battlefield. So I would say independent political organization and independent political action, absolutely. But that doesn't necessarily mean a third party. Again, going back to what Carl has written about the 6 parties, I believe it's called, 5 or 6 parties. I always get the number wrong. But within the Democratic Party, you have these different groupings, and they are grouped around caucuses. And they sometimes function more or less like parties, but they don't function enough like that. But outside, in groups like the Working Families Party, New Virginia Majority, et cetera, these are organizations that are grassroots based. And we need to energize them. We need to expand their numbers. That's a direction that I would recommend, at least electorally.
I'd like to move now to John. Why don't you share your comment? You've had your hand up a while, and then we're going to move to close this down. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, I think what Bill pointed out about the transformation of the Republican Party, and that it's not the Republican Party of even 20 years ago, and that there is a huge difference today between the Republicans and the Democrats, which did not exist 20 or 30 years ago. And also that if you vote for the Democrats today to keep MAGA out, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing you can do. That there's no contradiction between that and organizing independently. I think those are really important things to think about. I also think, though, that we have to realize, look, from India to Sweden and Denmark, you've seen the rise of MAGA-type movements. So there's an international component to it. And I think that it's more than just the issue of the end of the Cold War. And I'd like to talk about my experience working with carpenters who, the great majority of them were Trump supporters. This was up in Seattle when they moved to organize a wildcat strike against the employers.
Another minute, John.
Okay, thank you. And their own leadership. And what I found was it was through action, through actually struggling and participating in the class struggle, including against the union bureaucracy. That was what changed them, not discussion and all of that. And so I think that means that we have to organize within the unions, to transform the unions, to completely reject the bureaucracy's ideas of the team concept. As far as working class candidates, I do think that we can run working class, independent, anti-democratic party working class candidates at the local level. I think we can do that effectively as a start and connected with a struggle at the local level. Thank you.
Thanks, man. All right, at this point, we'd like to turn it back over to Bill to see if he has any final thoughts that he would like to share with us, with regard to his presentation tonight, which I think is very good. Bill, give us a few of your final thoughts, and then we're going to move on in the program.
Well, first, again, Ashaki, I want to thank you and SWA very, very much for this. A few thoughts. One is that I'm very optimistic. That may sound very strange because I painted a bleak picture, but it might be the Star Trek in me. I'm not quite sure, but
Oh my God.
as Captain Kirk says at some point, the odds are against us and the situation is dim. But that's okay. That's what we expect. I am very inspired by a lot of what I've seen in the last couple of weeks since Biden withdrew from the election. I am inspired by the way that Trump is being ridiculed. I am inspired by the kinds of actions that are happening at local levels, the struggles that people have been involved in around Palestine, for example. So I'm actually optimistic, but we need organization. And unfortunately, since the Reagan era, collective action, even among progressives, has been put down and replaced by individual actions. And the lack of paying attention to organization and building organization, and this whole tendency that I call the walkaway phenomena, where if you're in an organization and there's a problem, people just walk away. As back in the day when I was becoming radicalized and I was around the Black Panther Party, the whole notion was opposing something that was called no struggle, the no struggle mentality, that when there were problems, you struggled them out. And we seem to have lost that. And people think it's like changing the channel. Like, you don't like a show? Okay, you flip the channel and go to something else, as opposed to understanding we've got to struggle things out to build something better. So, Ashaki, I think part of it, we've got to build an organization. We have to retain a level of optimism and hope that we can defeat our opponents because we actually are the majority. And that's demonstrable. We are the majority, but there is something that was called anticipatory compliance by an author whose name escapes me. But the basic idea is that sometimes when the far-leaning forces will assume that the victory of the far right is inevitable, and they will stop resisting. And they will just simply say, well, and I heard people saying this, Ashaki, I heard people saying, oh, well, Trump's going to win. Say, no, danger, Will Robinson. No, you can't be, no, there is no inevitability to that. And that's what I really want to underline, folks. There is no inevitability to that. We absolutely can take these bad boys down, but it's going to be a protracted fight. No matter what happens on election day in November, MAGA is not disappearing in November. We have to demolish ideologically and politically the far right. I know that we can do that. One final point, going to something that John said just now, I want to just say action alone will not be enough. I remember reading this article by the late Mike Davis about a major struggle that took place in California. And one of the major leaders of that struggle, a great rank and filer, at the end of the struggle, goes off and joins the Tea Party. And Mike was completely distraught. I mean, I could see that in what he was writing, that this person went through all of this and seemed to be radicalized only to join the Tea Party. it has to be action and theory, action and education that go together. People come to all kinds of conclusions. And we've seen this where Klansmen in unions have been very militant, carrying on strikes, but wouldn't break from being Klansmen because they didn't see that as inconsistent. In fact, there's a long history to a kind of proto-fascist trade unionism that has existed in the United States. So education and action, keeping that optimism, being real, and everybody read Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Good advice on that. Thank you so much, Bill. This was great to open up an important discussion that we need to be having all over the country right now, particularly those of us who consider ourselves the left or progressives or wanting to transform. And the question of organization that you raised is, I think, critical. Organization is the greatest weapon that the oppressed have. And so we have to give our, really serious attention to that, enabling us, to better and better challenge the